3 weeks after she buried a man she had been quietly planning to leave Corinne. Hallett sat at her kitchen table in Calhoun's Crossing, Tennessee, with $211 in her checking account, a cup of coffee gone cold at her elbow, and the slow underwater feeling of a woman who had just realized she did not know what she was grieving. The house was too quiet. It had always been quiet when Edmund Hallett was alive, but that had been a different kind of quiet, the kind that pressed against her, that she had spent 31 years trying to fill with conversation he never quite met her halfway on. This quiet was different. This quiet had a shape to it. It sat in the recliner by the window. It stood at the kitchen counter where he used to make his coffee before she was up dark and strong. The smell of it, the first thing she registered every morning before she was fully awake. She had not made a full pot since the funeral. She did not know how to make exactly 1 cup's worth and not feel the waste of the rest. Edmund Hallett had been 59 years old when his heart stopped on a Sunday morning in March. He had been a quiet man his entire life, and he died the same way, without announcement, without drama, without giving her any warning that the silence she had grown so used to was about to become permanent. The man who found him called the county sheriff, and the sheriff drove out to Corinne's house on Dollar Street and told her that Ed had passed peacefully fast, the way the lucky ones go. She had pictured a riverbank. She had pictured a lawn chair and a fishing pole and a tackle box open in the grass beside him, because that was what he had told her every Sunday for 9 years when he climbed into his truck before she finished her first cup of coffee. Going fishing. Back before dark. He never brought fish home. She had stopped asking around year 4. The funeral was on a Thursday, and Corinne had expected maybe 20 people. The pastor, a few men from the road crew Ed had worked with for the last decade. Her sister driving up from Knoxville, the neighbor who fed their cat when they traveled. She did not expect the parking lot of Calhoun's Crossing Baptist to fill so completely that men were leaving their trucks on the gravel shoulder of Route 9 and walking up in their good boots. She did not expect 140 people to file through those doors. She stood at the front in a black dress that pinched at the shoulders, and she watched them come. Old men and young men and men her own age with gray coming in at their temples, and every single one of them, without exception, stopped at the casket and placed a hand flat on the wood before moving on. Not a pat, not a brief touch. A full deliberate placement, like they were pressing something in or taking something out, or simply needing to make contact with a surface that connected them to a man they were not ready to let go of. A man she had been ready to leave for 9 years. One of them stopped in front of her near the end of the line. He was somewhere around 30, with a little girl on his hip and a wife at his elbow, and when he opened his mouth to speak, nothing came out for a long moment. He stood there with his jaw working, and the little girl on his hip reached up and patted his cheek, the way small children do when they understand something is wrong without knowing what. Finally, he said, "Your husband changed the entire direction of my life, ma'am. I never told my wife what he did for me. I'm going to tell her tonight." And then he moved on before she could ask him what he meant. And the next hand was already in hers, and the moment slid away from her the way the whole day did, fast and blurred at the edges. There was an old farmer near the end, a lean man in his 70s in a suit jacket that had not fit him since a different decade, who took both of her hands in his and held them and said only he was a fine teacher. And when Corinne, confused, said teacher, the old man's face went careful and deliberate, the way a man's face goes when he has just said more than he intended, and he said of patience, "Ma'am. He taught me patience." And then he moved on. There was a large man near the back of the church, heavy-set with a trucker's build and a ball cap he was crushing slowly in both hands, who did not come through the line at all. He stood at the very back through the entire service, with tears running openly down his face, and he was gone before the last hymn finished, slipped out the side door without speaking to anyone. Corinne would learn his name later. She would learn everything later. At the time, she only registered his presence as one more piece of a puzzle she did not yet know she was supposed to be solving. She did not cry at the funeral. She had already cried in the church parking lot before anyone arrived, alone in the cab of her own truck, with the windows up, and what she had cried about was not grief in any simple sense. It was a knotted, complicated thing she did not have a clean name for. Sorrow, yes. but also guilt, the guilt of standing at the grave of a man you had been quietly planning to walk away from, of realizing that the last real conversation you could remember having with him had been about the gutters needing cleaning, something routine, something she had half listened to while her mind was already somewhere else. Somewhere like the folder in the bottom drawer of the bedroom dresser, the one she had been carrying from address to address for 9 years, moving it each time, like it was a piece of furniture, like it was simply part of what they owned together. The folder contained divorce papers. Corinne had filled out everything but the signature line. She had met Edmund Hallett in the summer of 1992 at a county fair outside Knoxville when she was 25 and waitressing at a highway diner, and he was 27 and already driving for a road construction company. He had not said much that evening either. He had been a quiet man from the very beginning, and for the first years of their marriage, she had understood his silence as depth, the way you sometimes do with quiet people, the way their stillness can look like contemplation, like a body of water with something substantial moving underneath. He noticed things. He refilled her glass before she asked. He fixed what broke without being told. She had mistaken attentiveness for intimacy, and it had taken her the better part of a decade to understand they were not the same. The cooling was not dramatic. There was no single morning she woke up and felt the temperature change. It happened the way erosion happens, so gradually, you do not notice the shape of the land changing until one day you look up and realize the river has moved. She had wanted a partner. She could talk to a person who was curious about her, who asked questions about her day and meant the answers. And what she had was a man who sat in his recliner every evening with the television on low, and his eyes somewhere she could not follow. She had reached for him in 100 small ways over the years. She had stopped reaching somewhere in her late 40s, and he, in his quiet way, had let her stop. By the time she filed the first set of papers, she was not angry at him. She was simply tired in a way that had no bottom to it. Tired of talking to a wall, tired of the one-sided evenings, tired of being alone inside a marriage. She had not signed them because there was always a reason not to yet. Not this year. After the holidays. After her sister's health sorted itself out. After. There was always an after. And then he died on a Sunday morning in March and took the after with him, and she was left at a kitchen table with $211 and a grief she could not properly name. It was the following Tuesday when she found it. She had been packing his things to donate to the church, working through the bedroom shelf by shelf, and she came to the Bible. Ed kept it between a coffee can of miscellaneous hardware and a stack of old pay stubs on the shelf above the dresser. Corinne had dusted around that Bible for 3 decades without ever opening it. They were not church-going people, not in any regular sense, and she had assumed it was his mother's kept out of habit rather than faith, the kind of object a household accumulates without anyone deciding to keep it. She took it down to put in the donation box, and when she did, the spine fell open in her hands the way a book will when it has been opened to the same page so many times that the binding has given up trying to stay closed, and a folded piece of paper slid out from between the pages and landed on the floor at her feet. She set the Bible on the dresser and bent to pick up the paper. It was thin, soft at the creases, the kind of soft that comes from being handled many times over many years. She unfolded it under the bedroom light. It was a warranty deed, stamped by the Harlan County Clerk's Office, dated April 2015. 2 acres parcel, 7 Old River Trace Road on the south bend of the Calhoun River. Grantee Edmund James Hallett. Purchase price $1,400. Corinne read it 3 times. Her husband had purchased riverfront land 9 years ago for $1,400 and had never once spoken a word about it to her. Not when they were talking about money, of which there had never been much. Not when they were talking about the future, which had happened less and less as the years went on. Not once in 9 years a single word. She stood there with the deed in her hand and felt the floor of her certainty shift beneath her. Behind the deed, still tucked inside the Bible, was a second piece of paper. She almost missed it. It was smaller than the deed, folded differently, and when she opened it, her breath caught in a way she was not prepared for. It was a hand-drawn map. Ed's handwriting. She would have known it anywhere, large, deliberate block letters pressed hard into the page, the writing of a man who had learned to grip a pen like a tool rather than an instrument. Every letter made with the kind of care that suggested each one had once cost him something. He had drawn the route from town to the river, marked the distance as 11 miles circled a road labeled Old River Trace, twice in ink that had gone over the same spot multiple times. An arrow pointing east along a line he had labeled Gravel Cut, and at the end of the arrow, a small square, the word shack. And beneath that, three words she would spend the next several weeks trying to fully understand. Keep it open. Corinne sat down on the edge of the bed with the deed in one hand and the map in the other, and the donation box at her feet half filled with his shirts. And for the first time since she had cried in the church parking lot, she felt something other than the tangled, nameless weight she had been carrying since the sheriff's car pulled up outside. She felt the alertness of a person who has just discovered that the story they thought they were living was not the only story being told. She did not sleep that night. Before the sun came up, she made a half pot of coffee by accident, poured it out, and made a single cup instead. She put the deed and the map in her purse. She drove south. The drive took her through country she had lived alongside for 30 years without ever properly seeing. Limestone bluffs catching the first gray light cedar pressing down to the road on both sides, the smell of it coming through the cracked window. Something sharp and clean that she did not have a word for, but that she associated, she realized now, with Ed. With the smell of him when he came home on Sunday evenings. River mud and cedar, and something else she had never been able to name. Something faintly chalky that she had filed away without examining the way you file away a detail that does not fit your working theory of a person. Old River Trace Road turned to gravel after the second cattle guard. The gravel was red clay dust the color of dried rust, and it rose behind her truck in a thin plume that hung in the still morning air. She counted 2 mailboxes in 11 miles. She found the gravel cut where Ed had marked it on the map, a break in the cedar just wide enough for one vehicle, with 2 ruts worn deep from years of regular use, and now beginning to green over down the center, where nothing had driven for 3 weeks. She followed the ruts down through the cedar and came out on a flat clearing above the river bend. The shack was there. It was not much from the outside. A single room, she guessed 16 feet by 20 at most, sided in rough-cut board gone silver gray with decades of weather. A tin roof rusted at the seams, but pitched correctly angled to shed rain toward the river. A short stovepipe, a narrow porch across the front, just 4 planks wide with 2 cedar posts holding up the overhang. A single window on the riverside with real glass in it, catching the early light and throwing it back warm. There was a padlock on the door, and sitting on the top porch step, watching her with its head tilted at an angle that suggested both curiosity and long practice with disappointment, was a dog. It was a medium-sized animal, brown and white, with one ear that stood straight and one that flopped forward at the tip. It was missing its back left leg, and it sat on 3 with the easy balance of a creature that had long ago stopped considering this a problem. It did not bark when she cut the engine. It did not run. It watched her step out of the truck and into the red dust with the stillness of an animal that had been waiting for someone and was not entirely surprised to find that the someone who arrived was not the one it had been hoping for. Corinne stood in the cold morning air and looked at the dog and said, "Hey," softly. The dog thumped its tail once against the plank and went still again. She tried the padlock. It held. She walked the perimeter of the building through wet grass that soaked through her shoes, past a stack of firewood split and stacked tight under a blue tarp, past a rain barrel at the corner of the roof, past the back wall with its single vent, until she came around to the river-facing window. She cupped her hands against the glass and pressed her face close and looked in. And she stood there for a very long time, because what she saw inside made no immediate sense, and she needed the time to let the pieces arrange themselves into something she could hold. There were chairs, not lawn chairs, not folding chairs. School chairs, the old-fashioned wooden kind with a curved writing arm attached at the right side, the kind that had populated American elementary school classrooms for most of the 20th century. There were a dozen of them arranged in 2 neat rows facing the front of the room. They had the worn, dark look of furniture that had been used regularly and with purpose. There was a chalkboard on the far wall, framed in oak real slate, the kind that had been removed from schools across the country when whiteboards came in, and this one had been found and installed here in a one-room cedar shack on a river bend in Tennessee with care and intention. Words were written on it in Ed's block capitals, large and deliberate, the quick brown fox. And beneath that, a column of words she could read from where she stood, thorough neighbor rhythm, Lieutenant February. The hard ones, the rule breakers, the words that did not behave the way the rules said they should. There was a floor-to-ceiling shelf along the left wall filled with books. Paperbacks, mostly some hardcovers, all of them with the slightly swollen look of volumes that have been through changes in temperature, been handled by many hands, been read and set down and picked up again. There was a small cast-iron wood stove in the right corner with a blue enamel coffee pot sitting on top of it. There was a desk at the front of the room, a simple wooden thing with a single drawer. And on the desk, a book lay open face down the way you set a book when you intend to come back to it. And beside the book, folded neatly, were a pair of reading glasses. Ed's glasses, the ones she had been told he was wearing when they found him. Corinne stood at that window with her hands cupped against the glass, and she looked at those glasses for a long time. The coffee pot, the chalk words on the board, the dozen worn school chairs in their two neat rows. She did not understand yet what she was looking at, not completely, but she understood with a certainty that came from somewhere below thought that she had been profoundly and entirely wrong about something. Not about one thing, about many things. About the fundamental nature of the man whose shirts were folded in a donation box back on Dollar Street. She drove back to town and went directly to Garrett Osby's feed and hardware store, because in Calhoun's Crossing, Garrett Osby was where you went when you needed to understand something the public record could not tell you. He was a wide, deliberate man in his mid-60s with reading glasses permanently pushed into his white hair, in a green canvas apron with the store's name stitched on the chest in faded gold thread. He had known Ed since they were both young men working summer road crews, and he was as far as Corinne had ever understood the closest thing Ed had to a genuine friend. He looked up when this bell above the door rang, and when he saw her face, he came around the counter immediately. She put the deed on the counter. She told him what she had found at the river. She described the chairs and the chalkboard and the coffee pot and the glasses folded on the desk. She asked him in a voice that was steadier than she felt what her husband had been doing out there every Sunday for 9 years. Garrett looked at the deed. He looked at her. He reached up and removed his reading glasses from his hair and folded them carefully and set them on the counter in front of him with the deliberateness of a man who needs both hands free for what he is about to carry. He said, "You ought to sit down, Corinne. I'll make coffee." This is a long story, and it isn't mine to tell short. He pulled a stool around for her, poured 2 mugs from the percolator in the back room, set one in front of her, and stood with his hands flat on the counter. He said Ed couldn't read until he was 34 years old. Corinne stared at him. She started to say that's not, and then she stopped. Because in 31 years of marriage, she had not once seen Edmund Hallett read a book. She had not seen him read a magazine or a newspaper or anything longer than the back of a cereal box, which he held at arm's length and put down quickly. She had thought he wasn't interested. She had thought with the quiet cruelty that long marriages sometimes permit that he was simply not that kind of person. And the word for what she had thought, the word she could not quite bring herself to complete, sat in her chest now, like a stone she had been carrying for 30 years without knowing it was there. "He hid it from everybody," Garrett said. "From you most of all, I'd expect. That's how it works with men like Ed. The shame of it goes so deep you can't find the bottom. He left school at 15. His family needed him working. And he spent the next 19 years getting through his life on memory and shape and pattern. Road signs by their outline. Invoices by where the numbers fell on the page. He'd hand a delivery ticket to the quarry manager and say, 'Read that back to me, my eyes are bad.' And that man handed it back to him for 20 years and never once knew." Garrett turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the counter. He said in 1999 there was an adult literacy program running one evening a week out of the public library in Millbrook, about 40 miles from here. A retired school teacher named Sylvia Crane ran it on her own time volunteer, no charge. Ed drove there after work every week for 2 years without telling a single soul. Not me, not you, nobody. He sat down with Sylvia Crane, and he started at the very beginning in the same place they start with 6-year-olds, and he learned to read. He was 34 years old the first time he read a complete sentence out loud and knew every word in it. Corinne set her coffee mug down because her hands were not reliable. Garrett said I asked him once years later what those first nights were like. He said he drove out there shaking every single time for months. Said walking into that library felt like walking into a doctor's office when you already know the news is bad. Said he sat down across from Sylvia with picture books made for children and felt the shame of it so physically he could barely get his mouth to work. He told me he came within a breath of leaving the first night without reading a single word. He was already standing up, and then Sylvia set a card on the table in front of him with a picture of a cat in 3 letters underneath, and she said, "Just try it." Not like a teacher, like someone who had all the time in the world and genuinely did not mind however long it took. Garrett's voice slowed. He said Ed told him that the thing that kept him in the chair, the thing that changed everything, was that Sylvia never sighed. She never looked at him the way people had looked at him his whole life when they caught the edges of what he couldn't do. That careful blankness people get when they're trying not to show you they've noticed. She just waited. And when he finally sounded out the first word, even a small one, she said, "There it is." Quiet, like he'd done something real. And he told Garrett it had been so long since anyone told him he had done something that he'd have sat in that chair until midnight just to hear it again. 2 years, Garrett said. 2 years he drove 40 miles each way after 10-hour shifts. And when he finally read his first complete book on his own, he sat in his truck in the library parking lot for a long time before he drove home. He told me he didn't cry. He said he was too tired to cry. But he said something shifted in him that night that never shifted back. Like a door he'd kept locked for 34 years had come open, and now that the air was moving through, he couldn't figure out how he'd lived so long in a room with no windows. Corinne sat on the stool and looked at the grain of the counter and said nothing. Garrett said after he could read, he read everything. He made up for time the way men like Ed do, without saying much about it, just quietly and constantly borrowing books from Sylvia from the library, from anyone who'd lend them. And he spent the next 14 years thinking about the men he knew who were living the way he'd lived, faking it, terrified, carrying it alone. He knew they were out there. He knew how they looked. He knew what their eyes did when someone handed them a form to fill out in public, the way they'd go still for just a second before they recovered and said their glasses were in the truck. In the spring of 2015, Garrett said Ed bought 2 acres on the river bend for $1,400 because it was cheap and private, and because a man who had spent his whole life hiding something understood that the men he wanted to reach would need a place to come where nobody could see them from the road. He built the shelves himself. He found the school chairs at an estate sale. He got the chalkboard from a church that was remodeling. And he started telling certain men quietly, one at a time, men, he'd identified the way you identify these things when you've lived it yourself, that there was a place on the river if they needed it. Sunday mornings, no cost, no names outside the room. He told their wives and anyone else who asked that he was going fishing. Corinne said, "How many?" Garrett thought about it for a moment, turning his mug. He said, "I couldn't tell you the exact count, but I know he kept a book, wrote down every name and the date they read their first complete book on their own. He had a name for that day. He called it the day the lights came on. He used to say, 'I just want to be there the day the lights come on.'" Corinne drove back out to the river. This time Garrett gave her a key from the hook behind his register, because it turned out that half the men in Calhoun's Crossing carried a key to that padlock, and Corinne had been the only person connected to the building who did not know it existed. This was the fact that went through her on the drive back out, not like a knife, but like a slow tide, like something rising like water finding the low places in a floor. She had been married to this man for 31 years. She had made his coffee and washed his clothes and lain in the dark next to him, and felt the silence between them as a kind of personal failure. Her failure, her inability to reach him. And the entire time 11 miles south of the house they shared, there had been this room and these men and this life he had been living that she had never been given a single word of. She unlocked the door and walked in. Inside, it smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and underneath both of those, faintly him. That combination she had spent 31 years breathing in when he came through the door on Sunday evenings, and which she now understood for the first time, was the smell of chalk dust and cedar and river air and old books, and the specific quality of a room where men had been sitting very still and working very hard at something frightening and important. Deacon followed her in and went directly to the space under the desk, turned twice and lay down with his chin on his front paws, and she understood from the ease of it that this was exactly where he always slept. She walked the rows. She ran her hand along the writing arms of the school chairs, worn smooth and dark, where adult forearms had rested, had pressed down, had steadied themselves for the difficult and necessary work of becoming legible. She stood at the chalkboard and read the words Ed had last written there, the quick brown fox at the top, every letter of the alphabet present, and below it the list of difficult words. Thorough, neighbor, rhythm, the ones that broke the rules. The ones he would have walked someone through patiently one more time, however many times it took. She picked up the book from the desk, a thin paperback, a children's chapter book about a boy and a horse. Inside the front cover, in a man's uncertain hand, the words, "For Ed's class." Below the title page, a slip of paper marking the place 2/3 through. On the slip, written in handwriting, she did not recognize unsteady but deliberate Ed. I finished it. The whole thing by myself. Ledger Mays. The man who had found him, who had stood at the back of the church in a crushed ball cap with tears running down his face and left before the final hymn. He had driven out on that last Sunday not to fish. He had driven out to read his teacher the last page of his first finished book, and he had found the teacher already gone, slumped over this desk, glasses on book, open, the light still on. The drawer at the bottom of the desk was stuck. She worked it open with both hands, the wood swollen from river humidity, and inside, beneath a box of chalk and a dog-eared attendance sheet, was the ledger. A hardback composition book, the black and white marbled kind, the cover gone soft and dark at the corners from years of handling. She carried it to the nearest school chair and sat down the chair exactly the right size for an adult who was learning something from the beginning, and she opened it. The first page in Ed's block capitals, Hallett Sunday School, started April 2015. Below that, 4 lines he had written and underlined. 1, anybody can come. 2, nobody gets laughed at. Ever. 3, you don't tell nobody who you saw here. 4, we start at the start. No matter how old you are. Then the names began. Amos Whitfield. Came June 2015. Lights on March 2018. Note in Ed's hand, oldest student, yet age 71. Cried when he read the newspaper out loud. Said he'd been pretending 50 years. Ledger Mays. Came January 2016. Lights on September 2018. Note drove 4 hours round trip every Sunday for 2 years and never missed one. Birch Tolliver. Came March 2019. Lights on November 2019. Note youngest yet. 26. Wanted to read to his baby girl. Did it before she was 2. Page after page after page. 41 names, 41 dates. 41 notes in Ed's careful hand, each one marking the specific human fact of the day: someone stopped being afraid. And then in the last several pages of the book, scattered among lesson plans and word lists, something she had not expected. Sentences that were not about the men at all. They were practice. Ed had been practicing his own writing the way he had taught his students to practice theirs. And what he had been practicing over and over, crossed out and begun again, was a letter. To her. Corinne, there is something I've been meaning to tell you for 9 years, and I don't know how to start it. Crossed out. Corinne, I know you think I've got nothing to say. That's not exactly right. It's more that. Crossed out again. Dear Corinne, I am not a man who has been easy to know. I understand that. What I want to say is, and again a few pages on the handwriting, steadier the letters, more sure of themselves, like a man who has been practicing long enough to feel the pen begin to become an extension of the hand rather than a foreign object. Corinne, by the time I get the nerve to hand you this, I want it to be written good enough that you'll see I meant every word. So I am practicing. A man taught me that you can learn anything at any age if you are not too proud to start at the start. I should have told you this years ago. Every Sunday I drove out here, I was thinking I would come home and finally tell you what I... And there it stopped. Mid-sentence. The last entry in the book written in the weeks before March, in the steadiest hand of all the attempts, the hand of a man who had finally been getting somewhere. It stopped because he had run out of Sundays. Corinne sat in the wooden school chair with the composition book open in her lap, and Deacon warm against her foot, and the river moving gray and patient past the window, and she cried in a way she had not permitted herself since the parking lot 3 weeks ago. Not for the man she had been married to and thought she knew. For the man who had spent 9 years driving 11 miles every Sunday to turn the lights on in other people, who had been teaching himself at 59 years old how to write a love letter worthy of the woman he had spent 31 years failing to reach and who had not gotten there in time. She had been so certain. That was the thing that hollowed her out most completely. Not that he was gone, that she had been so certain she knew what the silence meant, and she had been wrong about it from nearly the beginning, and she had spent 9 years with a folder in a drawer getting ready to leave a man who was 11 miles away every Sunday turning lights on. She sat there until the river light shifted and the cedar smell came through the open window, and Deacon stirred under the desk and put his chin on her knee. And then she closed the ledger and she held it against her chest, and she looked at the chalkboard one more time. The quick brown fox. Every letter of the alphabet present and accounted for. She did not know yet what she was going to do. She did not know yet about the man who would come up the gravel, cut in a white SUV, with dealer plates and a real estate company magnet on the door, or what he would want, or what it would cost her to say no. She did not know yet about the 41 men who would come to stand on the narrow porch with their caps in their hands, or what they would tell her, or what it would feel like to hold all those pieces of Ed at once and finally see the whole shape of him. She only knew sitting in the school chair in the morning light with the ledger against her chest, and the three-legged dog warm at her feet, and the smell of wood smoke and old paper, and him soaked into every board of this room, that the 3 words on the map were not a mystery anymore. Keep it open. It was not an instruction left for a stranger. It was written by a man who knew his wife, who had watched her for 31 years, even when she thought he wasn't paying attention, who understood something about her that she had not yet understood about herself. He had been counting on her to find it. He had been counting on her to know what to do. Corinne drove home from the river that evening with the ledger on the passenger seat and the key to the padlock in her coat pocket. She made dinner she did not eat. She sat at the kitchen table until the windows went dark and the house made its familiar sounds around her, the furnace cycling on the refrigerator's low hum, the creak of the third porch step that Ed had been meaning to fix since 2019. She listened to all of it differently now. Not as the sounds of a quiet life she was preparing to leave, as something else entirely. She did not go to the dresser drawer. She left the folder where it was and went to bed and lay in the dark, listening to the house settle into silence. And for the first time in longer than she could measure, the silence did not feel like accusation. She made up her mind sometime before dawn. She had no plan yet, no clear sense of what keeping it open would require or what she herself was capable of. She only knew that the 3 words on the map were not a wish. They were a directive, and that a man who had spent 2 years driving 80 miles round trip after 10-hour workdays to sit across from a patient woman with a stack of picture books had not left that directive casually. He had written it in hard block capitals, pressed into the page with the same force he brought to everything he had ever committed himself to, and she was not going to let it sit there unmet. What she needed first was Sylvia Crane. Garrett had given her the name on her first visit to the feed store. Sylvia Crane, he'd said, 83 years old, Millbrook retired school teacher, still alive, still sharp as a new blade. She had been Ed's teacher in 1999. She had sat across from a terrified 34-year-old man and said, "There it is," when he read his first word, and she had meant it like it was something real. Corinne needed to know how she had done that. Not the technique of it, the interior of it. She needed to understand what it felt like from the inside to sit with someone in the specific vulnerability of not knowing a thing the world had decided they should already know, and to make them feel, despite that vulnerability, that they were not diminished by it. Nobody told her to go. Garrett did not suggest it. She simply woke up on a Thursday morning, found the address in the county directory at the library, and drove 40 miles south to Millbrook, with the windows cracked and the heater running and the radio off because she needed the quiet to think in. Sylvia Crane lived in a small white house on the south side of Millbrook, with a yard so full of bird feeders that the sound of it reached Corinne before she was fully out of the truck. A constant layered conversation of wrens and chickadees in something lower and more deliberate she could not identify. The woman who answered the door was small and erect, with white hair cut close and pale blue eyes that assessed Corinne with the calm precision of someone who had spent decades making accurate judgments about what people needed and how much time they had to give it. She said, "You must be Ed Hallett's wife. Come in. I'll put water on." The inside of the house smelled of books and something herbal, rosemary or thyme, and every flat surface held either a plant or a stack of paper or a bird-related object. A carved wooden cardinal on the windowsill, a watercolor of a heron above the mantel, a field guide left open on the kitchen table. Sylvia moved through it all with the easy authority of a woman who had arranged her world exactly as she wanted it and saw no reason to apologize for any of it. She poured tea and sat across from Corinne at the kitchen table and folded her hands in her lap and waited, which was Corinne would come to understand simply what Sylvia did. She waited. She had the patience of someone who had sat with frightened people for 60 years and had learned that what most frightened people needed most was simply a person who was not in a hurry. Corinne told her what she had found: the deed and the map and the ledger and the 41 names, the unfinished letters at the back of the book. She told her about the school chairs and the chalkboard and Ed's reading glasses folded beside the open book on the desk. She told her about standing outside in the wet grass and looking through the window and not being able to make sense of what she was seeing. She told her about the folder in the dresser drawer and the 9 years and the not yet and the after that never came. Sylvia listened to all of it without interrupting once. When Corinne finished, Sylvia was quiet for a moment. She turned her teacup in her hands, the same slow circling motion Garrett had made with his coffee mug, and Corinne understood it was something people did in this part of Tennessee when they were choosing the right words, some local habit of deliberation she had never noticed before. Sylvia said, "I want to tell you about the first night he came." It was October, she said, 1999. The literacy program ran on Tuesday evenings, 7 to 9, in the back room of the public library. Most of the people who came were younger people in their 20s who had slipped through school with gaps in them, people whose situations made regular attendance difficult, people who needed the practical skill of reading for work or for their children and were willing to accept the specific humility of asking for it. A few were older. Ed was the oldest she had ever had. He sat at the far end of the table, she said, as far from the door as he could get, which was what people did when they were terrified and determined in equal measure. They put themselves where escape was most difficult, so they couldn't talk themselves into using it. He wore his work clothes still dusty from the day because he had driven directly from the job site, and she understood from this that he had not gone home. First, had not given himself time to reconsider, had simply come straight from work before his nerve could desert him entirely. His hands were flat on the table when she sat down across from him, pressed against the surface, the way hands press against something solid when a person is trying to hold themselves still. She had seen it before. She knew what it meant. It meant this man had made a decision that cost him considerably, and he was not going to unmake it, and the least she could do was honor that by not wasting a single second of his courage on anything unnecessary. She put a card on the table in front of him, a simple white card with a picture of a cat in the upper left corner and the word cat printed in large letters below it. She pointed to the word and said, "Just tell me what sounds you hear." He stared at it for a long time, she said, long enough that she could see the muscles in his jaw working. And then in a voice so low she had to lean forward to catch it, he sounded out the letter sounds one by one. Not the word, just the sounds. Three sounds, the beginning and the middle and the end of a small word that a first grader could read in half a second. And he built them with the painstaking care of a man laying stone, making sure each one was solid before he moved to the next. When he finished, she said, "There it is. That's exactly it." She told Corinne that she had said those words or some version of them thousands of times over her career to children and adults alike because they were simply the truest things she knew how to say in that moment. The person had done the thing. The thing was real. It deserved to be acknowledged as real and not made smaller by qualification or excessive praise or the enthusiasm that sounds like relief, like you weren't sure they could do it, but you're glad they proved you wrong. There it is just meant the thing was true. It was there. It existed. They had put it into the world, and it was real. Ed, Sylvia said, looked up at her when she said it, and the expression on his face was something she had not forgotten in 25 years. Not gratitude, not relief, not the complicated pride of someone who has just accomplished something in spite of their own expectations. It was simpler than all of those things. It was the expression of someone who has been invisible for a very long time and has just for the first time been seen. He came every Tuesday for 2 years without missing a single session, Sylvia said. He drove 40 miles each way in every kind of weather. He sat at the far end of the table every time, same seat, same pressed flat hands, same quiet and total commitment. He was the hardest working student she had ever taught and the least willing to give himself credit for it. Every week when he made progress, and he always made progress, she could see him trying to calibrate whether it was enough, whether the distance he had covered justified the distance that remained. He carried his own measuring stick, and it was not a generous one. She had told him near the end of the second year that he was one of the most capable students she had ever worked with. He had looked at her for a moment and then said, "I'm the slowest one in the room." She had told him that the slowest one in the room was sometimes the one who understood it deepest, because they had not had the luxury of skating past the places that were hard. They had been required to stop at every one and work it through until it held. He had thought about that for a while, and then he had nodded once the way Ed apparently nodded when he accepted something as true, and he did not argue the point further. When he finished his first complete book on his own, she said he came to the next Tuesday session and set it on the table in front of her. She asked him what he thought of it. He said it was the best thing he had ever read. She told him it was a fairly ordinary adventure novel. He said, "I know. That's not what I meant." Corinne sat at Sylvia Crane's kitchen table with the tea cooling in front of her, and she thought about a man who had spent 34 years without access to the written world, and then entered it slowly, painstakingly over 2 years of Tuesday evenings, and who, upon finishing his first complete book, had said, "That's not what I meant." She thought about all the evenings she had sat across from him at their own kitchen table and felt the silence as a sign of absence, of lack, of a man with nothing interior to offer. She thought about how much it was possible to be wrong about a person you had slept beside for 3 decades. Sylvia said, "I want you to know something about why he built that school, because I think you may believe it was simply about paying back what he'd been given. And that was part of it, certainly. But that wasn't the whole of it. When he told me a few years after he'd started the Sunday sessions about what he was doing out on the river, he said something I have thought about many times since. He said, "Miss Sylvia, I spent 34 years believing I was less than other men because I couldn't do a thing they could do. I know that's not rational. But shame isn't rational. It lives in the body, not the mind. It lives in the hands that press flat on the table." He said the only thing that addresses shame in any useful way is being in a room with another person who carries the same shame and watching the lights come on for them. Because when you watch it happen for someone else, you understand finally that the shame was never about the truth of who they are. It was always about what they were taught to believe. And once you see that clearly in another person, you cannot unsee it in yourself. She walked Corinne to the door when it was time to go. And on the threshold, she took Corinne's hand in both of hers, the grip of someone who had held many hands in many difficult moments and knew the difference between holding on and holding up. She said, "Your husband was not an easy man to know. I understand that. But I want you to understand what you are dealing with now with that school, with those men, with what he built. He built it out of the specific material of his own worst experience. He took the thing that had caused him the most damage and he turned it inside out and used it to help other people. That is not a common thing. That is not something most people are capable of doing or willing to try. She let go of Corinne's hand. She said, "Keep it open." Corinne drove home through the same limestone and cedar country, and this time the quiet in the truck did not feel like something missing. It felt like something that needed to be held carefully, the way you hold something breakable when you finally understand its value. She was 4 miles from home when the decision arrived fully formed and unambiguous, the way the most important ones sometimes do. Not as a question she needed to consider, but as something she already knew and was simply now catching up to. She needed to find the men in the ledger, not wait for them to come to her. Go to them. And when she found them, she was going to ask them something hard. But that was not for yet. There were other things first. She came home and went directly to the bedroom and took down the Bible and turned to the back of it, past the maps of the Holy Land, past the family tree. Page Ed had never written a single name in. Past a postcard she did not remember being there. And in the very last pages, folded into the back cover, she found it. A single sheet of paper folded twice in Ed's block capitals. She unfolded it under the bedroom light. I, Edmund James Hallett, being of sound mind, leave everything I own to my wife Corinne Hallett, including but not limited to the 2 acres and building located on Old River Trace Road, Harlan County, Tennessee. I want the school kept open for as long as she is able. Witness this day, March 14th, 2022. Below that, Ed's signature pressed hard into the page the way all his writing was. Below that, Garrett Osby. Below that, Sylvia Crane. A note in smaller letters at the bottom. Notarized copy on file, First County Bank of Harlan, March 15th, 2022. Corinne sat on the edge of the bed and held the paper in both hands and felt the relief move through her so completely that it left her dizzy. He had done this 2 years before he died. 2 years before his heart stopped on a Sunday morning in that classroom, he had driven to the bank and had this witnessed and notarized and filed as if he had known, as if he had been making arrangements for exactly this possibility, as if he had understood in his quiet and total way that the thing he had built was worth protecting, and that the person he trusted most to protect it was the woman sleeping on the other side of the bed from him, whether she knew it yet or not. He had written "Keep it open" on the map because he had known she would be the one to find it. He had known her better than she had known herself. She was still sitting on the edge of the bed, the will in her hands, when she heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway. She went to the window. In the driveway, gleaming and wrong against the ordinary afternoon light of Dollar Street, sat a white SUV with dealer plates and a magnetic real estate sign on the driver's door. The man getting out of it was about 42, soft through the hands and jaw, in the way of someone who had never done prolonged physical labor, wearing a quarter-zip pullover in a shade of blue that suggested careful choices. His boots were clean. They had never been anything but clean. She had met Denton Hallett exactly twice in 31 years of marriage, both times at funerals, and neither time had he made a particular impression on her, except as a peripheral figure at the outer edges of Ed's sparse family. Someone who sent a card at Christmas and had a real estate career in Nashville and was, she had understood without ever being told directly, not someone Ed had much use for. She went to the door before he knocked. He smiled when she opened it, a wide, prepared smile, the kind that arrives too quickly and stays too long. And he said, "Aunt Corinne, I'm so sorry I haven't been out sooner. I've just been trying to give you space. Can I come in?" She did not invite him in. She stood in the doorway. He adjusted smoothly, the adjustment of a man who had encountered closed doors before and knew how to work around them. He said, "I'll be brief. I know you've been out to the river property. I heard you've been spending some time there. I want to talk to you about it before things get complicated." She said, "What things?" He said, "Well, that's the thing." He put one hand on the doorframe, casual and proprietary, and looked past her into the house the way a man does when he is calculating. He said, "Ed and I had an understanding. He knew I was in real estate. He knew I had the contacts and the knowledge to handle a property transaction properly. And he told me a few years back that he wanted this land to stay with family, with someone who could do something useful with it. We shook on it. Now, I know that's not paperwork, and I'm not trying to make this adversarial. He paused. He said, I've been working with a development group out of Nashville. They're putting a resort and outdoor hospitality complex in along this stretch of the Calhoun 200 cabin units restaurant full amenities. It's a significant project, significant investment in this county. The site engineers have identified that the only viable access route for the northern staging area runs across that 2-acre parcel. He said, parcel the way you say it when you want something to sound like a logistical problem rather than a place. He said they're prepared to offer what I think is a very fair number for a piece of riverbank with an old building on it that's been sitting unused. $60,000, Corinne, for a shack. He let that sit for a moment, let the number do its work. He said, I have a buy-sell agreement already drafted. You sign, I handle the transaction, you get the money, the resort gets built. And you don't have to worry about maintaining a property 11 miles from town that you have no practical use for. She said it has a use. He tilted his head slightly. What kind of use? She said, my husband taught 41 grown men to read in that building. For free, on his day off, for 9 years. The chalkboard in there has the last lesson he ever wrote. The book on the desk is what he was reading when he died. Something moved across Denton's face. Not guilt. Something closer to recalibration, the expression of a man who has just discovered the ground is different than the map suggested and is deciding quickly how to reroute without losing momentum. He said, that's a real meaningful story, and I mean that sincerely. But a story doesn't stop a development plan, and it doesn't pay property taxes. He lowered his voice by a register, the register of a man about to do someone a favor. He said, I'll be straight with you. I've looked at the estate situation. Ed didn't have a lot. He died without much in the way of organized assets. If there's any question about the legal standing of the property, if he died without a properly executed will, the estate goes through probate, and as blood family I have standing in that process that a surviving spouse doesn't always supersede. I'm not saying that to threaten you. I'm saying it because the simple path, the path where you walk away with $60,000 instead of a lawyer bill you can't afford, is right here in front of you. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded set of papers, set them on the doorframe between them. He said, think about it. They need an answer by the end of the month. He went back to his white SUV, and she watched him back out of the driveway with the careful ease of a man who believes he has just left something inevitable in motion. The magnetic sign on his door caught the afternoon light as he turned onto Dollar Street. She watched until he was gone. Then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table with the will in front of her, the one she had found 40 minutes ago in the back of the Bible, witnessed by Garrett Osby and Sylvia Crane on March 14th, 2022, with a notarized copy on file at the First County Bank of Harlan. She thought about $60,000. She thought about the lawyer bill she could not afford. She thought about the 31 years of habit she carried, the deep groove of going along, of not making the fight, of sliding things to the front of the drawer and telling herself not yet. She felt the familiar pull of it, the persuasive logic of the easier path. The voice that said, you are 57 years old and you have $211 and you have been alone for 3 weeks, and this is not a battle you are equipped to win. Then she thought about a 34-year-old man pressing his sweating hands flat against a library table in the town of Millbrook, 40 miles from everyone who knew him, in a room full of picture books meant for children, deciding whether to stand up and walk out before anyone found out what he could not do. She thought about him choosing to stay. She thought about him making that choice week after week for 2 years, with no guarantee it would amount to anything, because the alternative was remaining exactly as afraid as he had always been. She put Denton's papers on the counter under the fruit bowl unread. She picked up the phone and called Garrett. He said one word when she told him about the visit. Denton. The way you say a word when it confirms something you have long suspected. Then he said Ed had a will, Corinne. I know it for a fact. I'm one of the witnesses. She told him she had found it. The silence on his end lasted several seconds, and in it, she could hear the quality of relief that comes when a person has been waiting for someone else to find the thing they hoped they would find. He said, "Good. That's real good. You take that to the courthouse tomorrow morning and get a copy on record, and then you call Denton back and tell him to speak with your estate attorney." She said, "I don't have an estate attorney." He said, "You don't need one yet. You just need to say the words. Trust me on that." She did not sleep well that night, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness from the previous weeks. Not the sleeplessness of grief or guilt or the tangled confusion of a woman who has just discovered the floor of her certainty has given way. It was a sleeplessness of someone who is preparing, who is organizing what she knows and what she does not know, and deciding what the next necessary thing is. By morning, she knew what it was. She needed the men from the ledger, not to feel better, not to be comforted or surrounded by people who had loved Ed, though all of those things were happening anyway, peripherally, in the form of casseroles left on the porch and cards in the mailbox. She needed them for something specific, and she needed to ask them for it directly without softening the request or making it easier for them to say no. She needed them to stand up. Denton had filed a petition with the County Planning Commission, she learned from Garrett the following morning, requesting a condemnation hearing for the Old River Trace parcel on grounds of public benefit to the resort development. The hearing was scheduled for the last Thursday of the month, 17 days away. She had a will. The will was airtight. Garrett confirmed the notarized copy on record at the county clerk's office, exactly where it should be. On paper, Denton had nothing. But paper did not always win the room, and the room was a public planning commission hearing with a Nashville development group presenting glossy site plans and talking about job creation in a county that had been losing young people for 30 years. And she was a 57-year-old widow standing between them and what they wanted. And the only argument she had for why the building mattered was the human truth of what had happened inside it. She needed the men who could speak to that truth. She started with Amos Whitfield because Garrett told her he was the one who had come to the shack most often after the funeral, who had stood on the porch the longest before he could bring himself to leave. She drove to his farm 7 miles east of town on a Wednesday morning and found him in the barn working a length of fence wire with a pair of pliers. He was 75 years old and built like someone who had spent 7 decades doing hard physical work and had no particular opinion about that one way or the other. He set down the pliers when she came in and looked at her with the steady, patient eyes of a man who had been expecting her. She told him about the hearing. She told him what Denton wanted. She told him about the will and why Denton's petition had no legal standing, but why that might not be sufficient in what she was asking. She said, "I need you to come to the Planning Commission hearing and tell them what Ed did for you, in public, with your name on it." The barn was quiet. Outside, something moved in the pasture. Amos looked at the fence wire in his hands and was quiet for a long time. He said, "You know what you're asking." She said, "I do." He said, "I hid this thing for 50 years. My wife, my children. People I've known my whole life in this county. None of them know." She said, "I know." He looked at her for a long time then, not sizing her up. Something more like recognition. He said, "Ed used to say the shame was never about the truth of who you were. He said it was always about what you'd been taught to believe. He said once you saw that clearly in another person, you couldn't unsee it in yourself." She said, "Yes, that's what Sylvia told me too." He nodded slowly once the way Ed apparently nodded when he accepted something as true, and she felt something move in her chest at the recognition of it. He said, "I'll come. You tell me the time and I'll be there." She found Birch Tolliver at his house on the north end of town, a young man of 30 with a daughter on his hip and a wariness in his eyes that dissolved the moment she said Ed's name. She found Ledger Mays at the truck stop on Route 9, where he layered over between long hauls, a large, quiet man who listened to her in the cab of his parked rig with his hands folded on the steering wheel and his eyes on the windshield. And when she finished, said, "Only tell me where to be and when." She found 4 more that week, and 3 the week after, truckers and farmers and tradesmen men who had driven out to a cedar shack on a river bend once a week for months or years and had come away carrying something they had not arrived with. Each conversation was its own difficult thing. its own negotiation between what was being asked and what it would cost. Two men said no. She understood. She thanked them and left. Nine men said yes. She needed more. She called Garrett. He gave her four more names she had not found in the ledger and an address she had not known about. She called those four and got three more yeses and one silence that she left alone. 12 men, 11 who would come. Enough. The night before the hearing, she sat alone in the shack with the wood stove going and Deacon asleep under the desk and the river making its patient sound outside the window. She had brought the ledger with her. She opened it to the last page of Ed's unfinished letter and read it again in the lamplight. Every Sunday I drove out here, I was thinking I would come home and finally tell you what I... She closed the ledger. She sat with it against her chest for a while, the way she had sat with it the first day in the school chair, with Deacon warm against her foot and the river moving past outside. Then she put it in her bag carefully and she turned off the lamp and she stood in the dark for a moment while her eyes adjusted. She was 57 years old. She had never spoken in front of a room of strangers in her life. She had never fought for anything. She had spent 31 years going along following staying quiet, sliding things to the front of a drawer, and telling herself she would deal with them later. She had carried a folder full of papers. She never signed a decision. She never made a life. She never quite chose one way or the other. Later had run out. She locked the door. Deacon stood at her knee. The river moved past in the dark, heading south toward where the development group's resort would eventually stand a mile downstream, which was fine, which was its own thing, entirely separate from this 2 acres in this building and the 41 names in the composition book she carried. She drove north through the cedar and limestone, and somewhere in the middle of those 11 miles she stopped, being afraid, or rather she stopped letting the fear make the decision. She was still afraid. She was going to be afraid tomorrow in that room, and she understood now that this was simply the condition under which the necessary thing would be done. Ed had pressed his shaking hands flat against a library table for 2 years. She could stand at a podium for 5 minutes. The county courthouse in Calhoun's Crossing was a 2-story limestone building on the town square that smelled of old paper and floor wax, and the institutional staleness of a place that had been conducting official business in the same rooms for 80 years. The Planning Commission met in the basement, a low-ceilinged room with fluorescent lights that buzzed slightly at one end and metal folding chairs arranged in rows facing a long table where 5 commissioners sat with their name placards and their water glasses, and the careful expressions of people who believed tonight would be uncomplicated. Corinne arrived 40 minutes early. She sat in the second row with the ledger in her lap and the notarized will in a manila envelope beside her, and she watched the room fill. She had not expected the room to fill. She had told 11 men to come, and she had expected 11 men, and perhaps their wives, perhaps Garrett, perhaps Sylvia. If Garrett had thought to ask whether she wanted to make the drive up from Millbrook, she had not expected the folding chairs to run out. She had not expected people to begin standing along the back wall in both sides of the room. Neighbors and townspeople and men she recognized from the feed store and the gas station and the diner on Route 9. People who had apparently heard something through the network of a small county and had decided that whatever was happening tonight in the basement of the courthouse was worth showing up for. Denton arrived with his lawyer 12 minutes before the scheduled start. The lawyer was a trim man in a gray suit carrying a leather portfolio and a rolled site plan under one arm, and he moved through the room with the easy confidence of someone who had done this many times in many counties and found the process reliably predictable. He set the site plan on the easel at the front of the room and unrolled it and clipped it into place. And Corinne could see from where she sat the glossy renderings of the proposed resort, the clean architectural lines of 200 cabin units stepping down a hillside toward a rendered river. Sailboats on the water, a sun perpetually setting in the upper right corner of the image. Denton sat in the front row and crossed one leg over the other and did not look at Corinne. He had the settled posture of a man who has done his math and found it satisfactory. The chairman called the meeting to order at 7 o'clock precisely and gave a brief procedural summary that most of the room had stopped listening to by the third sentence. Then he introduced the applicant's representative, and the lawyer in the gray suit stood up and moved to the front of the room with his portfolio and began. He was good at it. Corinne gave him that. He spoke clearly and with calibrated warmth, the warmth of a man who understood that rural planning commissions respond better to a tone of respectful partnership than to the aggressive efficiency he might use in a city room. He talked about the resort project in terms of the county's future, the hemorrhaging of young people to larger markets, the need for an economic anchor, the tax revenue, the construction jobs, the permanent hospitality positions, the way a project of this scale could change the trajectory of a community that had been contracting for 30 years. He used the word opportunity 7 times. He used the word partnership 4 times. Then he turned to the matter of the parcel. He described it as a 2-acre plot of undeveloped riverfront with a single outbuilding of no historical designation, no commercial value, and no active use. He noted that the property had been identified by the site engineers as the only viable corridor for the resort's northern access road, and that without this corridor, the project's northern phase could not be built as designed. He spoke briefly about the legal process of eminent domain condemnation for public benefit, which he described as a straightforward and well-established mechanism for exactly this kind of situation. He sat down. The commissioners were nodding. The chairman looked out at the room and asked in the tone of a man who expects no answer whether anyone wished to speak in opposition to the application. Amos Whitfield stood up. He was 75 years old, and he moved like it carefully and with deliberate economy, the way men move when they have learned that the body has a budget and unnecessary expenditure is foolish. He wore a clean-pressed shirt, pale blue, with a collar button he had fastened all the way up, and he carried in one hand a folded section of newspaper. He walked to the small podium with the microphone, and he set the newspaper on the surface, and he smoothed it flat with the palm of one hand slowly, deliberately the way you smooth something you have been waiting a long time to be able to touch. He adjusted the microphone. He looked out at the room. He said, "My name is Amos Whitfield. I'm 75 years old, and I've farmed in Harlan County my whole life. My father farmed here and his father before him. I went to school in this county until I was 14 years old, and then I went to work, and I did not learn to read properly before I left." The room was quiet. He said, "I hid that fact for the next 50 years. From my wife, from my children, from every person in this county who thought they knew me. I built a whole life around not being found out, and I was good at it because shame makes you creative in ways that nothing else does. A man will do remarkable things to protect a secret that he believes would destroy him if it came to light." He paused and looked down at the newspaper. He said there was a man named Edmund Hallett who built a one-room school on the south bend of the Calhoun River and taught grown men their letters on Sunday mornings for 9 years for free because he had once been exactly where we were, and he understood what it cost to stay there. He found me when I was 71 years old. I drove out to that building for nearly 3 years. He never once made me feel less than what I was. He never sighed. He never hurried me. He just waited. And when I got something right, he said, "Good," real quiet, like I'd done something worth saying out loud. He put his hands on either side of the newspaper. He said, "I would like to read you something." And then Amos Whitfield, 75 years old, bent his head and read aloud from the newspaper. A short article about a county high school baseball team's regional playoff run. 4 paragraphs. Nothing important. Nothing remarkable in any way, except that every word landed in the silent room with the weight of something that had been a very long time coming. He read slowly and he read clearly, and he did not look up until he reached the final sentence. And when he did look up, half the room had its hand over its mouth. He folded the newspaper and put it back in his shirt pocket. He said, "That is the building you are proposing to demolish for an access road. I would like every person in this room to know what it is before you vote on what to do with it." He picked up his newspaper, nodded once to the chairman, and walked back to his seat. The room made a sound that was not quite anything, not applause, not murmur, something lower and more collective than either of those things, something that passed through the people standing along the walls and sitting in the metal chairs like a current through water. Birch Tolliver stood up next. He was 30 years old, lean and dark-haired with his daughter on his hip, a small girl of 4 or 5, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's skeptical expression, and she surveyed the room from her position with the calm authority of a child who has been carried into many adult situations and has decided to make her peace with it. Birch carried a thin children's book in his free hand. He said his name and his age and that he had come to the shack on the river when he was 26, newly married with a daughter just born, unable to read a bedtime story to his own child. He said he had made up words off the pictures for 6 months before someone told him about Ed Hallett, and that the shame of making up words to his baby daughter's books had been the specific thing that finally drove him to make the drive out to the river on a Sunday morning with his heart in his throat. He held up the book, a small paperback with a rabbit on the cover. He said, "Ed sat with me for 9 months. He never told a soul. The day I read this book to my daughter by myself, she was 14 months old. She couldn't understand the words yet. She didn't need to." He looked down at the girl on his hip, and she looked back at him with complete composure. He said, "She hands me books every night now, and I read her the real words. That is the building you want to put a road through." He sat down. Ledger Mays stood up third. He was a large man, broad through the chest and shoulders, with a trucker's unhurried quality of movement, the ease of someone accustomed to long distances, and the patience they require. He did not carry anything to the podium. He stood there for a moment looking at the room, and when he spoke, his voice was low and even and entirely steady. He said, "I'm the one who found Ed Hallett on the morning he died. I had driven out to the shack to read him the last page of the first book I ever finished on my own. I had been his student for 2.5 years. I wanted to read him that last page in person because I thought he deserved to hear it. I found him at his desk with his glasses on and the book open in front of him and a look on his face that I have thought about every day since March. He was gone already. But he looked like a man who had just heard something good." He paused. He said, "I want every person in this room to understand what you would be running a road through. Not a shack, not 2 acres of river access. The place where a man who had been living in the dark his whole life was finally given light and then spent the rest of his life making sure other men got the same thing. There is no version of progress worth enough to justify putting a road through that." He sat down. And then the others came, one after another, steadily, without theater, without performance. 11 men in total standing at the small podium under the fluorescent light in the basement of the Harlan County Courthouse and saying the thing they had carried in silence for decades, and then demonstrating simply and without embellishment. The thing that had been given to them in a cedar room on a river bend by a quiet man with a chalkboard and a coffee pot and a composition book in which he wrote down the day the lights came on for each of them. A mechanic who had run a transmission shop for 30 years without being able to read a work order, read aloud from an automotive repair manual slowly, every technical term correctly sounded, and when he finished, he looked at his hands, the way men look at things that have carried a secret for a long time. A farmer in his 60s read 3 verses from a Bible his mother had given him 40 years ago. A young man barely out of his 20s read the front page of that morning's newspaper from beginning to end, including the weather forecast and the commodity prices. And when he reached the end of it, he simply looked up and said, "I couldn't have done that 2 years ago." The room was completely silent between each speaker. Not the silence of people being polite, the silence of people who have just understood something they had not understood before and are sitting with the weight of it. The marina lawyer in the gray suit had stopped looking at his site plan somewhere around the third speaker. His portfolio was closed on his knee. He was looking at the floor with the careful expression of a man who has just realized that the room he walked into is not the room he prepared for. Denton Hallett in the front row had gone the color of old ash. He was very still. He had walked into this room with a condemned parcel and a Nashville lawyer and 30 years of sales experience. And he was sitting now in a room that had just turned that condemned parcel into the most important building in the county, one testimony at a time, and there was not a single thing in his considerable professional toolkit that addressed the situation. After the 11th man sat down, the room held its silence for a moment that felt longer than it was. The chairman looked at his notepad. He looked at the other commissioners. He looked at the lawyer in the gray suit, and then he looked away from the lawyer in the gray suit. He said, "Is there anyone else who wishes to speak before the commission deliberates?" Corinne stood up. She carried the manila envelope and the ledger, and she walked to the podium, and she set both of them on the surface, and she stood there for a moment and looked at the room. 130 people, maybe more. Garrett near the back with his reading glasses pushed up into his white hair. Amos in the third row with his newspaper back in his shirt pocket and his root-knuckled hands folded in his lap. Birch with his daughter asleep on his shoulder now, the girl's dark head heavy against his neck. Ledger sitting very straight, watching Corinne with an expression she recognized from somewhere and then placed it, was the expression Ed had in the one photograph she had of him from early in their marriage. Not happy exactly, something more specific than happy, the look of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be. She took the will from the manila envelope and held it up. She said, "My husband owned this land free and clear, and he left it to me in writing, witnessed and notarized and on file at the Harlan County Clerk's office, with one instruction." She set the will on the podium. She picked up the ledger and held it so the room could see the cover, the worn marbled black and white of it, the corners gone soft and dark from years of handling. She said, "This is the record my husband kept of every man who came to that building. 41 names. Beside each name, 2 dates, the day they arrived and the day the lights came on." She opened it to the back pages. She did not read from them. She simply held the book open so that the people in the front rows could see the pages, see the block capital handwriting, see the lines crossed out and begun again. She said, "These last pages are letters my husband was writing to me. He never finished them. He was still practicing when he died. He had been teaching himself at 59 years old how to write me a letter good enough to deserve me." She paused. She did not look at the ledger. She looked at the room. She said, "You want to run a road through the place where my husband learned how to say he loved me." She let that sit in the room the way the silence between the testimonies had sat, heavy and clear and demanding to be held. She said, "I will not sign. I have a will, and I have 41 names, and I have 11 men who just stood up in front of this county and told you what that building is. Route your road somewhere else." She picked up the ledger and the envelope, and she walked back to her seat. The commissioners deliberated for 11 minutes. The vote was 4-1 in favor of denying the easement application and recommending the parcel for county historical designation. The one dissenting vote came from the commissioner on the far left, who had been looking at his phone throughout most of the testimonies. Denton left before the vote was announced. She watched him go, the clean boots moving quickly up the basement stairs, the gray suit lawyer packing his site plan back into its tube with the deliberate care of a man who has been paid regardless of outcome and is therefore unbothered. The door at the top of the stairs opened and closed, and the sound of it was smaller than she expected. She sat in her metal folding chair while the room came back to life around her. Chairs scraping, voices rising, people moving toward her with their hands extended and their faces carrying the expression of people who have just witnessed something they will talk about for the rest of their lives. She shook hands and she said, "Thank you," and she held herself together through all of it, which required more effort than the 5 minutes at the podium had required. Because the podium had required only the thing she had prepared for, and this required the thing she had not. It was Garrett who finally got her out, steering her gently through the thinning crowd with one hand at her elbow. He walked her up the stairs and out into the cool night air of the town square, and she stood there for a moment with her face turned up and her eyes closed and breathed. She heard footsteps behind her. She turned. A woman she did not know was standing at the top of the courthouse steps. She was perhaps 65, small and spare with white hair and the patient, composed expression of someone who has come to deliver something and intends to do it properly. She was holding an envelope. She said, "You're Corinne Hallett." Corinne said yes. The woman said, "My name is Vera Pruitt. My husband was Clarence Pruitt. Ed came to our house every Sunday for the last 4 months of Clarence's life, when Clarence couldn't drive anymore, when he couldn't get out to the river." She stopped. She steadied herself in the way people steady themselves when they are carrying something heavy and have been carrying it for some time. She said Clarence was dying, and the thing that was eating at him, the thing he could not make peace with, was that he had never read the Bible his mother gave him. 60 years he'd had it. Couldn't read a word of it. So Ed drove out to us every Sunday for those 4 months and sat at our kitchen table and helped Clarence read it. A little at a time, patient as anything, never charged, never told a soul. Clarence made it to the Psalms before he passed. She held out the envelope. She said, after Clarence died, I found a note among his things. He'd written it to Ed. It took him most of a week to write it. I went out to the shack to give it to Ed, and I found out Ed had already passed. The dates were close within the same month. She paused. I kept it because I didn't know what else to do with it. But tonight, watching what happened in that room, I understood that it belongs with you. Corinne took the envelope. It was light, barely anything the weight of a single sheet of paper handled many times. She said, "Thank you, Vera." Vera Pruitt nodded once, and then she went down the courthouse steps and across the square, and Corinne watched her go, and then she opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper folded twice. The handwriting on it was labored, the letters large and uneven, the product of enormous effort and very little practice, but every word was legible, and she read it once and then she turned it over. On the back in Ed's block capitals was a note she had not known to expect. She stood under the courthouse lights and she read it. It said, "Corinne, if you find this, you already know. This is why I drove out every Sunday. I was practicing the whole time, not just reading, you." She stood very still for a long moment. Around her, the square was emptying cars pulling out of their spaces, headlights sweeping across the limestone facade of the old buildings. The night air was cool and smelled of cedar from the ridge behind town, and she understood now, standing here, that she had been smelling that smell for 31 years and had never known what it meant. He had known she might not find the ledger immediately. He had known that the circumstances of his death were unpredictable and that there were any number of ways in which his unfinished letter might remain unfinished in ways even he had not intended. He had prepared a contingency. He had given this note to a man he knew was dying, entrusted it to that man's wife, left a chain of custody that would reach Corinne at the moment when she most needed to receive it, which was not at the kitchen table 3 weeks after the funeral. Raw and disoriented, but here tonight, after she had done the thing he had believed she was capable of doing. He had known her better than she had known herself, and he had arranged his faith in her accordingly. She folded the note and put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the pocket of her coat next to the key to the padlock. Garrett drove her home. She did not talk much on the way, and he did not require her to. A week later, Denton called. She let it go to voicemail. His voice on the recording was smaller than she had ever heard it, diminished by several registers from the man who had stood in her doorway with his clean boots and his drafted papers and his $60,000. He said only, "I didn't know what it was. I want you to know that. I didn't know what it was." She did not call him back. She did not delete the message. A man could be exactly what she had seen him to be in her doorway and still somewhere in the bottom of him be capable of honest acknowledgement. She knew something about shame now, about what it did to people, about how it made them smaller than they might otherwise be, and how the only thing that addressed it in any useful way was exactly what Ed had spent 9 years demonstrating in a cedar room on a riverbend. She was not going to waste Denton's shame. She was also not going to pretend it undid what he had tried to do. She left the voicemail where it was. The resort was built. It took 14 months, and by the following summer, there were 200 cabin units stepping down the hillside a mile downriver, and a restaurant with a river view deck, and a parking lot full of out-of-county vehicles on weekends. And it was by all accounts good for the county in the ways the Nashville lawyer had said it would be. Corinne drove down to look at it once in the early fall when the construction was finished and the first guests had arrived. She stood in the parking lot and looked at the buildings and the boats on the river and the sun on the water. It was fine. It was what it was. None of it touched the 2 acres upriver where the cedar pressed down to the bank, and the shack stood gray and quiet with its chalkboard and its coffee pot and its school chairs worn dark at the writing arms. The county put up a historical marker at the entrance to the gravel cut on Old River Trace Road. Brown metal, modest, the kind that people drive past without reading. It said, "Hallett Sunday School established 2015, Edmund J. Hallett educator." Most of the resort guests who drove past it on their way to the cabin check-in never gave it a second look. This would have suited Ed perfectly, and Corinne knew it, and the knowledge was a small, warm thing she carried. She restarted the Sunday sessions in April. She had talked to Sylvia about method to Amos, about the specific texture of a room full of frightened men to Ledger, about what it felt like to be on the other side of the desk. She had read everything in the shack's bookshelf twice, and she had made notes in the margins of a new composition book she bought at the hardware store, the same black and white marble kind Ed had used, because it seemed right to continue in the same format he had established. She was not a natural teacher, not in the beginning. She was too quick, too ready to complete a sentence when a student hung on a word, too inclined to let the silence become uncomfortable before she had the courage to let it breathe. She had to learn patience the way Ed must have learned it one frustrated Sunday at a time, by sitting on her hands figuratively and sometimes literally and simply waiting for the word to arrive in the student's own time and in the student's own mouth. She learned that the river window was not for the view. She had thought it was in the beginning, had thought it was one of Ed's small aesthetic choices to give the room something to look out at while the hard work happened. Then she sat through her third Sunday with a 50-year-old electrician named Dawes, who looked out that window every time his eyes got wet, turning his face to the river for 10 or 15 seconds before he turned back to the page, and she understood. The window was not for the river. It was for the 10 or 15 seconds when a grown man needed somewhere to direct his face while he recovered his composure without having to explain why he needed to. Ed had put it there on purpose. Ed had put everything in this room on purpose. In June, a man named Waverly Dunn came. He was 48 years old, a roofer heavy-set with hands that had been making contact with rough surfaces his entire adult life. He came 3 Sundays in a row before he said more than 10 words total, and then on the 4th Sunday, he settled into the chair across from Corinne and said, "I have a daughter in 8th grade who's been reading my mail to me for 2 years without saying anything about it. I need to fix that." She sat with Waverly Dunn for 4 months. He worked hard and he was not quick, and she learned sitting across from him that the speed of the thing was irrelevant, had always been irrelevant, that the only meaningful measure was whether the lights came on, and that when they came on in exactly the same way, regardless of how long the dark had lasted. The day Waverly finished his first complete book, a short novel about a man building a boat, she knew before he reached the last page that he was going to get there. She could hear it in the way his voice had changed over the months, the way it moved through a sentence, now with the ease of someone who had stopped dreading the next word and started trusting it. When he turned the last page and read the last line and closed the book and sat there quietly for a moment, she said nothing. She waited, and when he looked up, she said, "Good. That's it exactly." He came the next Sunday and told her that he had read his daughter's last 2 report cards at the kitchen table out loud while she sat across from him. He said she had not said anything for a while after. Then she had said, "Dad, I've been waiting for this." He told Corinne this in a voice that required several stops and starts to complete, and she kept her face still and her voice low the way Sylvia had taught her without knowing she was teaching her. And when he finished, she said only, "That's real good. That's exactly what it's for." In September, she found the folder. She had been cleaning out the last of the bedroom drawers. The deep lower drawer she had been avoiding since March, the one under the winter sweaters she only wore twice a year. And there it was, exactly where she had left it. 9 years old, the edges of the papers soft from handling the creases in the documents, deep and permanent, from being folded and unfolded and refolded so many times. Everything filled out but the signature line. The document of a decision she had been carrying for 9 years without ever quite making. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. She thought about all the things she had believed when she first put the papers in this drawer, and all the things she now understood had been wrong. She thought about the cruelty of having been right about some things, that Ed had been difficult to know, that the distance between them had been real, that the years of one-sided evenings and half-listened conversations had constituted a genuine and legitimate loneliness. And wrong about the most important thing, about what the silence meant, about what lived behind the closed door. She had been right that the door was closed. She had been wrong that it was empty. She drove out to the shack that evening. She put the folder on the desk next to Ed's reading glasses that she had never moved and never would. She opened the wood stove and she laid the papers in one by one, the petition and the affidavits and the financial declarations and the carefully organized documentation of a life she had nearly chosen, and she watched each page catch and change and become something else. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel guilty. She felt the quiet relief of setting down something she had carried so long that she had stopped noticing the weight of it, the way you don't know how tired your arms are until you finally put the thing down and feel the blood come back. Deacon watched her from under the desk with the long-suffering patience of a dog who has observed human behavior long enough to find most of it unremarkable. She closed the stove. She sat down in the school chair behind the desk. Ed's chair, the chair she had made her own over the past months, without quite deciding to, and she opened the ledger to the last page. She found the place where Ed's final unfinished letter stopped mid-sentence in the steadiest handwriting of all his attempts. Every Sunday I drove out here, I was thinking I would come home and finally tell you what I... She uncapped the pen she had brought. She thought about what to write for a long time. Outside, the river moved south in the early dark, carrying the cedar smell through the window she had left open, and Deacon's breathing under the desk was the only sound in the room. She thought about Sylvia Crane's kitchen and the bird feeders and the hands folded in the lap of a woman who had all the time in the world. She thought about Amos Whitfield in his clean-pressed shirt, smoothing the newspaper flat with his palm at the podium. She thought about Birch Tolliver's daughter asleep on his shoulder with her dark head heavy against his neck. She thought about Vera Pruitt on the courthouse steps with her envelope and her composed, careful face. She thought about a 34-year-old man sitting at the far end of a library table with his sweating hands pressed flat against the surface, deciding whether to stay. He had stayed. She put the pen to the page. She wrote Corinne Hallett, kept it open, started teaching April 2025. She looked at what she had written, then she moved the pen down one line because there was one more thing, the most important thing, the thing that had been waiting to be written since March, since the church parking lot, since the kitchen table with the cold coffee and the deed and the 3 words on the map. She wrote, "I know what you were going to tell me, Ed. I found it in every name in this book. I should have looked sooner. I'm looking now." She closed the ledger and set it on the desk beside the folded reading glasses. She capped the pen. She sat for a moment in the school chair in the quiet room, and the river moved past outside in the dark, and the cedar smell came through the open window, and Deacon lifted his head from the floor and set his chin on her foot, which he had done every Sunday since March without being invited to and without needing to be. She turned off the lamp. The room went dark except for the light coming through the river window, the ambient light of a clear autumn night over open water enough to see by, if you knew where things were, which she did. She locked the door and stood on the porch for a moment with the key in her hand and Deacon at her knee and the river below them in the cedar dark on both sides. The resort was a mile downstream, its lights reflecting off the water in a way that was actually quite beautiful from this distance, warm and scattered, nothing like what she had imagined when she first heard the proposal in a basement room under fluorescent lights. It was its own thing. It existed in its own mile. This mile was this mile, these 2 acres, this building, this porch, this dog, this night. She drove north through the cedar and the limestone 11 miles home, with the heater making its familiar rattle and the ledger on the passenger seat and the envelope in her coat pocket with Ed's last note to her, the one he had trusted to the right hands at the right time, the one that had arrived exactly when it was supposed to. The house on Dollar Street was dark when she got home. She made a full pot of coffee for the first time since March and sat at the kitchen table and let it cool and thought about Sunday. There was a man coming who worked at the grain elevator on the north edge of town, 53 years old, who had asked Ledger to ask her whether she had room for one more. She had said yes. She always had room for one more. She thought about all the things she had been wrong about, and all the things she had been right about, and the long, inexact work of understanding a person you have lived beside for 31 years. The way that understanding turns out to be not a destination, but a practice. Something you return to, something that is never finished. Something that requires you to keep showing up on the days when it is hard, and on the days when you are afraid, and on the days when the silence feels like nothing, and on the days when you begin finally to understand that the silence was never nothing. The coffee cooled in the cup. The house was quiet, a different quiet from March. The third porch step creaked once in the settling night and then went still. The refrigerator hummed. The furnace cycled on and ran its course and cycled off. She was 57 years old, and she was not too proud to start. She had started in April, and she would start again next Sunday, and the Sunday after that, 11 miles south, in a room that smelled of wood smoke and old paper and chalk, with a chalkboard on the far wall, and a composition book on the desk, and a three-legged dog asleep underneath it, and the lights would come on the way they always came on. In that room, one person at a time, slowly, and then all at once. And she would be there when they did. She had been wrong about almost everything that mattered. She had been given by a folded deed in a Bible she had never thought to open, the rarest thing a person ever receives. Not a second chance to know someone she had lost. Something more than that. A second chance to become the person he had always believed she was. The person who would find the map. The person who would drive 11 miles before sunrise. The person who would unlock the door and walk in and sit down in the chair and begin. The person who would keep it open.